higher that the knowledge and the facts will be contested in a different way. And this also comes to what's been talked about, this polarization of the legitimacy of both of institutions, but also the legitimacy of the media, of information, and that the government information that comes from governmental bodies will not be seen as facts. Mainly it will be seen as political. Everything's political and read into this polarized political picture. So that will be a challenge also on environment. I think what is possible to do when it comes to the institution is that the people are there. As I said, there are many Brazilians that have worked with this for decades, and they haven't been in those institutions during the government of Bolsonaro, but they can be hired back. It's not the capacity is there, the intellectual capacity. It will require funding, of course. I'm sorry. It will require funding, of course. So there needs to be a willingness to bargain environment and climate ahead of other issues. And I think there are also other expectations to the government or to Lula coming from other parts of civil society and other parts of society that also require a budget. So that's that may be a challenge. What I think it doesn't take a lot to improve is the recognition of indigenous peoples and their role in preserving the forest. Lula has promised a proper ministry for indigenous people. So that might give them more of a proper role. It's always been, you need to consult with the indigenous communities before anything's done in the Amazon, but to give them a ministry and to recognize their expertise may be important. And as I said before, on illegal deforestation, it's the laws are there. They've been there all along, but the implementation and the priority to implement and to give resources to that implementation is important. And here also the courts and all the different levels of legal institutions come into say, because what happened during, but it's happened before, but what accelerated during Bolsonaro was this legal licenses to deforest and legal licenses to avoid environmental to have exceptions for environmental laws and environmental regulations. So the legal deforestation and the system for registering land. So if you register your land as under one kind of protected regime, it's worth more than if you register under a protective regime with a higher protection, so then you can do less on your land. So these kinds of switching lands between different kinds of registers has been it need resources to do something with that kind of system. The system works very well for some actors, but these actors are usually not the ones that are on the side of the environment or climate. So it's the same that you have in Norway, for instance. We have a system that works very well for those working in the oil sector, and to turn that around is difficult, and it will not be easier for Lula to do it this time than it was the last time. So I think we need to, as the others have been talking about, we need to understand this. What is this polarization doing to the democracy? Like how can the government make decisions and those decisions being seen as legitimate, even if you do not agree with that system or that decision or that change? And that's a large challenge, and it's not only on environment and climate side, it's on different policies that the reality is so different from depending on who you talk to. So even a decision that is a democratic political decision may be seen as illegitimate, and thus the implementation is illegitimate too. If that's the case for a sufficient large group of people, then and that's a real democratic challenge. Even though the institutions work, even though the decisions are made in a democratic manner, even if the elections were democratic and the people making decisions are legitimately elected. So that's a challenge that Lula will have, and that will also manifest on different levels. So you have the local decisions, you have more national decisions, and you have maybe to a lesser extent it will be a challenge in national politics, because one of the institutions that have not changed too much, the way I see it, during Bolsonaro's government was the diplomacy. Like Brazil has very capable diplomats, and so the international politics have sort of been rolling, even though the situation at home has been very different. I don't know if that answered your question. Hey.
No, it's no. You raise a very important issues about legitimacy and democracy. That actually, I think I'm going to be a little bit unorthodox and change a little bit our script, because we are actually not so many here. So I would like actually to ask if our audience could want to ask some questions, because then we can have the round of questions from the audience, and then I can ask you to make some of the final remarks and final comments. Are you agree with that? Are you okay? Okay, if you wanna raise your hand, I think you can speak directly in the microphone. So Torshell, I see your hand up. So just ask your question.
And I'm trying to unmute myself. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, hello everybody. My name is Torshell. Sorry for coming in a little bit late. I was actually having a meeting with Yuri at Oslo Met.
Don't
so
blame me.
Back home very quickly in order to get home for this meeting. Thank you so much, all of you, for really interesting introductions and comments as along the way. I have a comment and some questions to Marcos, based on three quotes that in one of your first sections. You said first that there had been almost no resistance to the election result. And the second thing, you said that the threats to democracy had been exaggerated. And then on the comparing internationally, democracy only collapsed where it had weak roots, something like that. Those were three of your quotes. And my main argument here is that I think you're underplaying the threat to democracy posed by the Bolsonaro government. And several of the factors have been mentioned here already. About the no resistance, well, we also the blocking of the roads and the demonstrations and the campings in front of military premises that in some areas are still ongoing. Diego mentioned the formal complaint by PL to the election result. So I would not agree that there has been kind of no resistance to the election result. What I do agree on is that the Brazilian politicians and institutions and also international governments were very quick to acknowledge and respect the election result, which I see as a direct consequence of the troubles in the US elections 2 years ago, and the attacks in Washington. Then, as to the threats to democracy, I don't think they are exaggerated, but I must say I'm a little bit biased. I just wrote a book, which you can't see it; it's blurred. about the Brazilian, about Bolsonaro's attacks on democracy. It will actually be out in Portuguese in a couple of weeks. But I think, again, if we look on formal institutions and the politics by the Bolsonaro government, in all international democracy indexes, Brazil has fallen, and in some quite dramatically over the past 4 years. We see a really important thing, which is not so much covered in, at least not in international media, the closing down of hundreds of committees and councils where civil society and industry and academia met the government to try to shape public policies. And we've also seen a massive undermining of the educational system, the health system, etc. And in addition to all of these things, the attacks on the Supreme Court, especially on Alexandre de Moraes, on the election results, etc. And one of the things which for me was very worrying was that Bolsonaro, after having done very much better in the first round than that at least many expected, said that, well, if re-elected, he would change the composition of the Supreme Court and appoint 5 new ministers. If he had succeeded in doing that, I'm not so sure, but at least that was for me one of the last attacks on the other powers of Brazil, having in large degree control of Congress, and now only the Supreme Court will be left. And then the third, democracy only collapsed where it had no roots, and you mentioned the Philippines, Turkey, Hungary, Poland, Nicaragua, and we could mention Venezuela, we could mention Russia and China, etc. But then maybe a little provocative question to you. Then I would like to hear your reflections on this. Where would you put Brazil in this international picture?
Okay, that's a lot to digest, but I don't know if anyone else has another question that is like want to ask now, or should we wait? We can wait. Okay, Marcus, the floor is yours.
Right. Congrats on your new book. I look forward to seeing it
Thank you.
Circulating and read in Brazil. The first thing that we should be careful is that you mentioned health, education, and so on. These are not democracy in the sense that I would say 90% of political scientists use the term. Our view of democracy is independent of education or outcomes. So these are outcomes. Good health or good education tends to be to follow democracy, but democracy doesn't produce. That explains why inequality, for example, in the last 30 years have been increasing in democracies like Germany, France, the UK, or the United States. So inequality is an outcome as good or health outcomes, and there are debates on why this is so and so on. But you could say that this is a failure of democracy. It's a consequentialist approach to democracy, but it's not democracy in the as political sciences view the term. And you mentioned a number of indexes, and democracy has been almost uniformly losing quality scores in a variety of institutions, which I use, and I'm myself a respondent of the VDEM, one of the Brazilians that provide scores for the VDEM. I provided that in the past, but losing democratic quality is not the same as of destroying democracy. So these are different. We're talking here about gradients. So there's a very qualitative difference between non-democracies and democracies. You can say that some government have really implemented horrific policies with terrible consequences, but it has nothing to do with democracy, right? But we're talking here about being a threat to democracy, and individual acts or punctual examples of dysfunctionality and so on is not enough to qualify a country as democratic or non-democratic and so on. A related problem is with the adoption of participatory institutions like councils or non-councils and so on. You may defend and advocate some models, participatory models, but that doesn't mean that if you do not adopt participatory institutions, you're not democratic. For example, you don't have health councils in the UK or educational councils, Brazilian style, in the UK. Right? These are different institutional models of democracy. So across the countries, you see very enormous variations in terms of the adoption of participatory or direct democracies, right? Right here in our region, you don't have that in Uruguay. You have plebiscite, extensive use of participatory mechanisms, etc. But you don't see that in other countries in the region like Costa Rica. So we're talking here about different models or institutional formats for democracy, right? Some are more consultational, others are more majoritarian. You don't have that kind of thing in the health area, for example, in the United States. You have in the educational system, yes, but not in the United States. So democracy is not something that could be reduced to outcomes or to institutional formats or institutional models, nor can be reduced to what goes in the mind of rulers. And for example, if somebody like Bolsonaro, he's not a Democrat at heart, it doesn't make Brazil a non-democratic country. What happens is either he loses election, and he did, or he's defeated in various arenas. And the example you just give, if he had proposed the expansion of the Supreme Court, my bet is that the chances of that passing would be zero. I would like to see Diego's take on that because he's a specialist in the Supreme Court. First, that law proposal, that proposition, that a bill requiring a constitutional amendment would be regarded by the Supreme Court members as unconstitutional and would be shelved. Most possibly, that would be the first outcome, would never be considered. Second, senators would not agree to that at all. Bolsonaro count on a substantial number of very radical members, but they do not represent more than 15% of the calculations by most data indicators that we have from service and so on. So one thing is what goes on in the mind of a dictator, and the other thing is what is going on in society. And Bolsonaro managed to be elected in 2018 because of a combination of a perfect storm of a colossal economic crisis, the worst in 100 years since Campos Salles in the 1903. The output, the economic output fell by 10% in 2 years. So it was the fiercest economic crisis in 100 years, and at the same time of a colossal corruption scandal, a gargantuan corruption scandal that affected in the first stage the PT and subsequently affected also the PSDB. And so this created a window of opportunity for a total outsider. And because of the rejection of the PT, who was the incumbent, he managed to win the election. So we don't have a demand for autocrats in Brazil other than by 15% of the electorate. It was basically a supply problem of parties and politicians that collapsed and created this void. That was in Brazil. And he did not control, and Bolsonaro did not control neither a majority in the population nor in the states. All the large states were controlled by, just to give an example, a broader picture, he counted with the support of 3 governors out of 27. At the beginning, he counted with the support of 7 governors and was losing support. And in the end, he counted with the support of 3 governors. That's the situation. The majority of the population rejects Bolsonaro. Some have. Now the last point, I think I've used a lot of time, but just the last point on the resistance. There were blockades, road blockades that lasted for 48 hours, right? I was in 2 of them. I suffered, but it lasted 48 hours. And there are people demonstrated in front, as here we have and there are about I would say 100 people every day in the headquarters, and in a metropolitan region which has a population of 4,000 people, 4 million people. So there are 100 people there, but most democracies have extremists. Even Norway, there was that terrorist that killed how many people? 70 people, I don't know. Of course, there's a colossal difference in this individual behavior, but I mean, in all democracies, you have extremists, be it the US, Denmark, Finland, Norway, or Sweden. I think that to say that most people who voted in Bolsonaro are in favor of autocrats, I think it misses entirely the point, because most surveys indicates the opposite.
Okay, we have that was a very good question, because we have hands raised by our participants also. So Diego, do you wanna add something?
Okay, very quickly. Congratulations on the book. Good to see you again. So
I should mention, I forgot to mention that Diego was one of the people I interviewed for the book in Sao Paulo just a year ago in November last year. So thank you, Diego.
It's great to see it published. So just 2 questions, and then I'll briefly comment on Marco's point about the amendment. So is it legal to mobilize people to attack judges and to attack electoral results? Because this is what Bolsonaro was doing all the time. He didn't succeed, at least not in building enough support for you to have a difference. But as I said, I think this is the track he's pursuing. And I think the dangerous problem, if we think in the long run, is that if he's not punished, if nothing happens to him, we are signaling that the next president can do it again. And one day it will work. One day, perhaps it will be enough support. Like how many elections? Of course, I agree that we are in a better position now than we expected a few months ago, but still, I think this is his end game. And I'm not sure he's going to stay into politics, but it's still for future Bolsonaro wannabes, Bolsonaro 2.0s that might appear in the future. I don't think it's good to leave the message that the president can talk. As long as he doesn't do anything formally, he can talk and he can encourage people to attack institutions. And people under Bolsonaro have been punished for doing that. So a member of Congress was punished for doing that. Many other politicians were punished electorally for doing that. And yet Bolsonaro has been untouched by this so far. And I think that's a problem. And going to the point that Marcos raised, I agree, Marcos, that in Brazil, the judicial review of constitutional amendments is pretty routine. It became like a fixed feature of constitutional politics in Brazil. And an amendment that would amount to such an attack on the court, I think it would most likely, all things considered, be considered unconstitutional. However, if we think of this process over time, we need to consider that there's also the impeachment threat, right? People who were mentioning this amendment, they had 2 weapons at their disposal. Like there's the amendment to expand the court, and there's impeachment against individual judges. And Judge Moraes was the most controversial of all, perhaps currently. So I think it would all come down to the dynamics between the majority that could approve this amendment in Congress, perhaps could also say, look, if this is the easy way, you keep your jobs, otherwise we're going to impeach you. I don't think impeachment would be feasible in the next few months, but let's say, even if Bolsonaro had been elected, but let's say impeachment of Supreme Court judges. But let's assume for a moment that this is the main issue for Bolsonaro and his supporters, and they invest on keeping this on the agenda for a long time. To me, I wouldn't say that the court will be successful in building a majority, an internal majority, to strike down such amendments. Some judges might think this is the concession they might need to make. But I think this is a possibility. I'm not saying it's the most likely outcome.
Before I allow you to respond, Torshell, I will let Solveig say something. Solveig?
Yeah, I'm just trying to maybe come with sort of a middle position. I'm not trying to give any of that. I think you're both probably right in many aspects, but I think, I mean, between Torshell and Marcos, but I think they're different. In political science, there are different definitions of democracy as well, and you have the more traditional definitions that Marcus refers to, where you have the institutions in place, the elections, and all these boxes checked, but you also have schools that look more at civil liberties and different parts of democracy, for instance, protecting minorities from abuse of majorities. And in many of these aspects, the Bolsonaro government can be criticized. And also what Diego was mentioning, that you actually create or question the legitimacy of the democratic institutions that need to be there in order for people, or in order for the democracy to work. If you say that they're biased or they're politicized, and sufficient people believe that, then you may have violent acts, or you may have questions of other laws in society as well. But I think it's a democratic problem in Brazil is the lack of monopoly of violence on the part of the states. That's also a democratic problem, and that wasn't created by Bolsonaro, but maybe got worse. And also when you talk about democracy in other parts of Latin America, it's always the question that the courts have been used politically, and I think this has happened in Brazil as well, and that's questioning the quality of the democracy. So there are different ways of seeing it, and sorry, I hope that it will not continue down that road, that it be reestablished the belief in the democratic institutions for both sides, or also for those that supported Bolsonaro.
Thank you, Solveig. Torshell, you have a very short
Yes.
time to comment on the comments.
Yes, Marcus, thank you so much for clarifying. I think we do agree that democracy is not reduced to either format or institutions or policies, etc. And we also agree that democracy is not a question of black and white. It's either democracy or not. This is a continuum. And the VDEM Institute was actually one of the sources I used the most for this part of the book. And in their second last report, or the last report, they actually pointed to Brazil as one of the countries that have fallen the fastest on the indexes over the last years. And they point to Bolsonaro's rhetorics and politics to explain this, this development. And I think, but I still think, I would still underline the really serious threat to the Brazilian democracy under Bolsonaro, and just trying to think, what would have happened if he had won? He lost by less than 2 million votes. What would happen if he'd won? Maybe he would have managed to gather so much support in Congress that he could change the constitution. And just ending this, and who knows then what could have happened. And just another source that I used a lot was the Levitsky and Ziblatt book, How Democracies Die. And they have a quote there that since the end of the Cold War, most democratic breakdowns have not happened through soldiers or generals, but by elected governments themselves. And these democratic breakdowns, they happened gradually and even legally, and they carried out by the elected governments and the elected leaders themselves. So I'm very afraid that if Bolsonaro had been re-elected, Brazil would have taken even longer steps in the in direction of autocracy. And I really agree on in Diego's last point. If Bolsonaro now is not punished for what he's been doing over the last 4 years, it's kind of legitimizing another precedent for doing the same, maybe in the 2020s, after the 2026 elections.
Thank you, Torshell. Fortunately, or not, but for me, fortunately, Bolsonaro haven't won. And then I think if no one else in the audience has a question, I will go towards the conclusion of our webinar and actually ask our panelists, what is the main challenge for Lula, given that Bolsonaro have lost and will not try any undermining or of the results in the future. So what is like 1 minute for each of you, like what is the main challenge for Lula when he assumes on January 1st? Marcus, do you want to start?
Well, the main challenge is, in fact, linked to what we discussed before regarding his, I would call it, hyper-minoritarian status, right? He counts with a very small support in the Chamber of Deputies, and he has to negotiate a lot. And I don't anticipate any major crisis resulting from that. It would be, in a way, business as usual, except for the fact that there will be a fallout, which is civic cynicism and a political, lingering political malaise. And it has already started. Because if you read the new headlines in Brazil yesterday of the newspapers and today, one says that PT has guaranteed that he will support the secret budget, which for the entire year, it was denounced as the most outrageous arrangement and so on. So the PT is now supporting this arrangement. And the other is that Lula is now negotiating and making concessions, etc., with people like Arthur Lira, which was depicted as the devil incarnate, right? And now Lula has already said that in interviews and stuff, that PP will be part of the government. And part of the 2013 demonstrations in Brazil resulted from this state of affairs, right? Let's recall that during Lula and Dilma, many ministers from the far right party of the Universal Church, 2 ministers were ministers, were pastors, ministers, right? Crivella and, in other words, there would be business as usual, no crisis, and I don't anticipate any constitutional crisis and so on. But there are effects in terms of anti-system sentiment.
Okay, thank you, Marcos. Diego.
So I don't think the problems that I highlighted involving the Supreme Court are Lula's main problem. I think this is just my professional bias, and I agree with what Marcos said. And I'll just point to something that I don't know about. I'm not a specialist, but I'm very worried about considering what happened, which is the relationship with the armed forces, right? I think we need better rules regarding when officers can participate in politics, when they can speak publicly on political matters. And I think we had a problem with discipline in the Bolsonaro government. And I guess even sectors from the armed force would agree with this assessment. But this is such a dangerous topic to touch, to reform at this point. But I would like to see at least some steps being taken in the next few years to develop better control mechanism, clear rules for the conduct of judicial officers engaging in politics, and a bunch of other things that I'm just curious about. And I'm not an expert on the issue, but I think this is something I would add to the mix.
Oh, thank you. Maybe we should have a next webinar about military in Latin America again. Solveig.
Yes, I agree with both Marcos and Diego. I think it's in the last government, Lula had the problem, or he's quite good at delegating, at least on the environmental side. He delegated a lot of responsibility to the ministers. But then they were in conflict with the interests of other ministers. And I think he will come back to the same problem in this government, that the different branches of government will not necessarily pull in the same direction. So we'll have to settle that. And then he will have to deliver to his constituencies. And that will be difficult, given what Marcus portrayed, that the Congress is not on that side. So that will be his major challenge. Probably he will make great speeches to claim he has delivered on promises, but at some point it will be he will need to account for what's been done. And I for the sake of climate and environment, I hope that he prioritizes to deliver on those issues and on the rights of indigenous people, but it remains to be seen.
Okay, thank you very much all, and thank you for the audience. I can just say thank you very much for joining us, and we will have the video available also on our website, and I think it was very useful for everybody in Norway or here that follows up Brazil, and I hope we have more normal political discussions in Brazil, but we see how this sort of potential threat or like seed for turbulence will develop in the near future. But then we'll have another webinar for discuss that. But thank you very much, Marcos, Diego, Solveig, for participating. Thank you in the audience, and have a nice evening or a nice afternoon in Brazil. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Great.
Take care.
Bye-bye.